Good afternoon. I'm Joshua Bolton, a junior from Grand Rapids, Michigan, studying political science and business. And I would love to welcome you to the January Series 2018. We'd also like to give a special welcome to 4 of our 52 remote webcast sites: Scottsdale, Arizona, Savannah, Georgia, Whitehall, Michigan, and Kalamazoo, Michigan. And now, if you would all please pray with me. Merciful Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity to listen and learn from John Inazu as he shares with us about what it means to thrive within a diverse community. It's our prayer today that despite our deep differences, we can continue to learn to show the same love to our neighbors that your Son showed us. Lord, we pray to open our hearts that we may hear you today. In Jesus' name, amen. And now Kevin Dendalk, professor in the Political Science Department and the director of the Henry Institute, will introduce our guest.
Well, can we get along despite our differences? It's a weighty question in this era of political and cultural division. And our efforts to answer yes to that question, to achieve even a modest unity, those efforts don't often inspire confidence. But John Inazu, our speaker today, would like to boost that confidence. His latest book, Confident Pluralism, reminds us of the resources, both legal and cultural, that can help us survive and even thrive in the midst of deep differences. John comes at this question as both a scholar and a practitioner. He is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion and Professor of Political Science at Washington University in St. Louis. His scholarship is focused on the freedoms of speech, religion, and especially assembly, which was the subject of his excellent first book, Liberty's Refuge, aptly subtitled The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly. He writes broadly for mainstream audiences, and he has also remained active as a practicing attorney, often in disputes about first freedoms. His latest initiative, I commend this to you, is the Carver Project, a nonprofit focused on the crucial work of building better connections between Christian university faculty and their cities and local churches. John will be available to greet the audience in the West Lobby following the presentation, and his book will also be for sale. Calvin College is grateful to the Calvin Academy for lifelong learning and the Henry Institute for the study of Christianity and politics for underwriting today's presentation. Please welcome John Inazu.
Well, it's a great privilege to be with you today, and I want to thank Calvin College for the hospitality and also thank our sponsors as well. I'll add one welcome to a remote site of First Pres Asheville and Rebecca Gurney, so thanks for joining us there. I'm going to talk today about the deep differences in this country and how we might live together in spite of them. And if you need any convincing about that, maybe you don't, but if you need convincing, look no further than our coffee. It used to be that you and I could at least drink coffee in peace, but today even Starbucks is politicized, falsely accused of waging a non-existent war on Christmas, and legitimately accused of backing a host of progressive causes that have little to do with coffee. Not to be outdone by the political left, the Black Rifle Coffee Company now offers its Freedom Blend. I picked at random a few customer comments from the company's website. One person wrote, "My Keurig was finally liberated from all the other commie coffees out there." And another noted, "This coffee has crawled through the trenches of liberalism to my house to free me from the oppressive coffee I have been drinking." And all of this over coffee, but it's not just coffee. Red states and blue states, Fox News and MSNBC, Whole Foods and Chick-fil-A. We judge people's acceptability by where they live, by what they watch, and by what they eat. And increasingly, these other people aren't just wrong, they're immoral or evil or on the wrong side of history. This tribalism and our inability to find common ground pushes many of our fellow citizens toward more extreme positions, and we ourselves, when we think about it, are not entirely immune. So think about your own reaction, positively or negatively, to words or phrases like evangelical, Black Lives Matter, conservative, liberal, Muslim, atheist, stronger together, make America great again. We like to talk about unity in this country, and our revered documents describe us as one nation, indivisible, in pursuit of a more perfect union. But much of our actual difference exists with disagreement rather than unity. We lack agreement about the purpose of our country, about what it means to be a human being, and the nature of the common good. These differences pervade our backgrounds and our preferences and allegiances, and they end up affecting not just what we think, but how we think and how we see the world. This leads to a problem of what some scholars have called the fact of pluralism. And that problem leaves us with a practical problem in need of a political solution. The French philosopher Rousseau offered one response to that problem. Rousseau said, "It is impossible for men to live at peace with those they think are damned." And that's a rather bleak pronouncement. And I want to suggest that Rousseau was wrong, but if he was wrong, then we need a different possibility. And that's what I want to offer to you in confident pluralism, that our shared existence is not only possible but necessary. And instead of this elusive goal of unity, we might work toward a more modest possibility of coexistence across our deeply held differences. Now, for some people, and frankly for some Christians, this need for confident pluralism is only just now beginning to dawn. And this is especially true of white Protestants, of which I am half of one. And by that, I mean I'm half white, not half Protestant. And one reason I think that for white Protestants especially, this need to grapple with our differences is relatively new thinking, is that as recently as a half century ago, public and cultural norms in this country were underwritten by a distinctively American Protestant culture in the white middle class. And one consequence was that Protestant churches provided a segment of Americans with a large part of their identity. The vast majority of this population, whether or not they were devout, and many were not devout, still identified with some church and its basic teachings. And these teachings, for better and sometimes for worse, contributed to a largely monolithic way of thinking about religion and about morality in the white middle class. That's not the case today. As the Catholic writer Joseph Bottom has suggested, the crumbling of mainline Protestant churches as central institutions in our national experience may be the great explanatory event of the past few decades. Whatever one thinks about mainline Protestantism today, Bottom is right that it once provided an institutional framework that sustained a certain kind of Protestant culture, and that framework has largely collapsed. The reality of these changes is a mixed blessing. It comes with some loss of coherence, but it also brings gains both in terms of American culture and Christian theology. The current circumstances might remind Christians anew of our theological identity and allegiances, that this world is not our own and that we are to some extent aliens and strangers within it. And importantly, as we think about these changes, there's no past to which we might return. I sometimes hear people longing for the good old days when things seemed more coherent or easier to understand. But the problem with the good old days is it's hard to know when those were for everybody in this country. Going back to the 1950s is not a good bargain for African Americans. Going back to the 1940s is not where Japanese Americans want to be. Americans like my grandparents and my father who were born in the internment camps. The very real and pressing question is not how we recover the past, but how we engage in the present and look toward the future. Confident pluralism offers one answer to that question. It's the idea that we can embrace pluralism and difference around us because we are confident in our own beliefs and in the groups and institutions that sustain them. It takes both confidence and pluralism to do this. Confidence without the pluralism misses the reality of politics. It ends up suppressing difference, often violently. And pluralism without confidence misses the reality of people. It ignores or papers over difference for the sake of false unity and feigned agreement. Confident pluralism allows genuine difference to coexist without minimizing or suppressing our deeply held convictions. The goal here of this argument is not to settle which views are right and which views are wrong, but it proposes that the future of our democratic experiments requires finding a way to be steadfast in our personal convictions while also allowing the space for others to differ. This argument includes both a legal and a personal dimension, and these two are interrelated. Our inclination to shut a certain viewpoint outside the bounds of acceptable society begins with personal antipathy, but it often ends in legal prohibition, the desire to turn the law against our adversaries. And our history and our culture make clear that despite our best intentions, we are often the ones who do this when we grasp power. So how do we guard against this? Well, I want to start by suggesting that almost paradoxically, we need enough unity to recognize that we need to protect our mutual differences. And the constitutional anchor for this, which Kevin mentioned, I believe is the First Amendment's right of assembly, the subject of my first book. It's also, unfortunately for me, one of the least known provisions, even after my first book. So if you polled Americans today, you'd find that about 1 in 10 of them could even name the right of assembly in the First Amendment. But the founders knew about it, and they kept it in there for a reason. And one of the particular insights of the right of the people peaceably to assemble is that it's the only right in the First Amendment that requires more than one person to be exercised. The First Amendment has 5 rights: speech, press, petition, religion, and assembly. And I can do all of those other 4 on my own. I can speak even if no one else listens. I can be the press by starting a blog. I can in some ways practice religion by myself, and I can petition the government on my own, but I cannot assemble alone. Assembly requires at least one other person. And that suggests to me, and hopefully to you, that right from the beginning, the founders included in the First Amendment this important right that signified the reality of living together with people, that we don't actually go through life just as individuals speaking and petitioning on our own, but that sometimes we need to come together in groups, and that those groups establish a collective sense of identity, but they also allow us to form ways of life and practices that are different than whatever else is happening out there, and that inevitably our groups are going to have us live into different ways of life, which means there's going to be the reality of difference in this country, and that it will often be experienced in groups, and that we need to protect those groups, protect them from unlawful incursions upon dissent from majoritarian norms. The importance of assembly has been obscured by 2 more recent legal doctrines, and I'm going to talk briefly about both of those today. The first is the right of association, and the second is called the public forum doctrine. So let's start with association. The right of association is actually not in the Constitution anywhere. A lot of people seem to think that right is in there, but it was instead inserted by the Supreme Court relatively late in our country's history, in the late 1950s. And the Supreme Court subsequently said, we have this right of association that seems to be in there somewhere, and its most important form is what the court has come to call expressive association. So think about that for a minute. Expressive association is the core protection for the private groups of civil society. And what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that we value and we protect groups that are expressing something outward to others, conveying a message, or maybe having a protest or something like that. The problem there, though, is that groups actually exist and have their being in ways far greater than simply manifesting expression. So think about the groups that are most important to you or to me, and the ways that we, in very informal settings, come to know people and come to know something of ourselves, or maybe we pray together in a group. That's not outward expression, and that doesn't fall into this category of expressive association. And so our law has gone wrong by focusing on expression to the detriment of other important ways that groups actually exist in society. So let me give you an example of the challenge of expressive association. It's from the Top Hatters Motorcycle Club, which is a biker gang in California. And a few years ago, a few members of the Top Hatters went north to Gilroy, California for the Gilroy Garlic Festival. Does anyone know Gilroy in here? Gilroy is known as the garlic capital of the world, it turns out. And so no surprise, they're having a garlic festival. And the Top Hatters wanted to come to this festival, and so they walked up to the gates, and they were stopped by the authorities, who took a look at their vests and their insignia and said, "Those are gang colors. You're not welcome into the festival." And the Top Hatters filed a federal lawsuit, and the most important part of that lawsuit for our purposes is that 2 federal courts found that the Top Hatters were a non-expressive association. And because of that finding, they had no legal claim against the authorities who had excluded them from the festival. So that might be interesting to us on a number of levels, one of which is they were denied admittance for expressing something on their vests, and yet they were found to be non-expressive when they claimed a legal right to be there. That's a problem. But perhaps a deeper problem is that it makes little sense to call the Top Hatters non-expressive as an entire group. So I went to their website, and you can too, tophattersmc.com. And if you go there, you'll find their favorite music that you can play on the site. And you can look at pictures of the group getting together for picnics and social events. And you can find a mission statement and a tribute to a member who has died. These are all expressing lots of ideas. And the Top Hatters, like most of our groups, are inherently expressive, but they have no recourse to the right of expressive association. Focusing only on outward expression misses the inherent connections between a group's existence, its practices, and its message. And this right of association and the seemingly arbitrary distinctions that trouble us weaken the protections for the voluntary groups of civil society. Without stronger protections of the right of association, without a rehabilitated sense of what this needs to be, we will not have the possibility of confident pluralism. The second legal doctrine that I want to discuss is called the public forum doctrine. And this is the constitutional idea for the ability of you and me to voice expression or dissent in government-provided spaces, the physical and virtual spaces where we come together. Public forums can be actual places like city parks or town halls, and they might be non-physical or virtual spaces like a city website or a city or a state university's forum of student organizations. Those can all be public forums. These are essential to our democratic experiment. They provide a practical way for citizens like you and me to gather, to express, sometimes to protest, on topics of our choosing and on our terms in our ways. This ideal represents one of the most important aspects of a healthy democracy. It signifies a willingness to tolerate dissent, discomfort, and even instability. Today's public forum has been distorted by overregulation, and these violations now reach across the political spectrum. Under current law, political protesters in public forums are often sent to ironically named free speech zones far away from the site of engagement, and labor picketers confront oppressive restrictions in some public areas. Churches are now prohibited from renting generally available facilities in some cities. Protesters in New York parks, anti-abortion counselors on Colorado sidewalks, and political demonstrators in North Carolina have all been silenced by public officials overregulating the public forum. One of the most egregious examples of the violation of the public forum comes through criminal restrictions around what is known as an unlawful assembly. And this applies especially in public protests that we're seeing so often these days in the news. To be sure, law enforcement must be able to protect the public, and it must be able to protect themselves. But peaceable assembly is constitutionally protected even when it risks inconvenience. Strengthening protections for the voluntary groups of civil society and reclaiming the public forum are two of the essential constitutional aspects of confident pluralism. we have to insist that the people who govern us honor these basic principles. But confident pluralism ultimately also depends on you and me and what we say and how we interact outside of the law. One of the most important examples of this kind of agreement in our own lives or engagement is with our speech and with our use of language. The First Amendment allows us, it turns out, to say almost anything to anyone. Now, that's not entirely true. There are a couple of exceptions. Most famously, you can't yell fire in the crowded theater unless the crowded theater is on fire. You can't commit insider trading. You can't engage in a criminal conspiracy. You can't perjure yourself on the witness stand. But outside of those few examples, and maybe a couple of others, you can say almost whatever you want to almost anyone, and that includes harmful, psychologically damaging hate speech. We can tear each other down at the core, but that doesn't matter that we should. And so the question for us is, what forms of speech might be particularly harmful and what might we avoid? I want to give you two examples quickly: the hurtful insult and the conversation stopper. So let's start with the hurtful insult, and probably already examples are coming to mind. Some versions, especially those based on race, gender, sexuality, are not fit to mention here. Other hurtful insults are more commonplace but can sting just as much: fat, short, ugly, friendless. The hurtful insults that we hear so often and sometimes receive are based on human identity, and they aim for the most vulnerable and most exposed dimensions of our humanity. These insults could be false or misleading or hyperbolic, but they might also be true. They could be fact or they could be opinion. And sometimes they're spoken out of attempted humor and other times out of spite or malice. All of them, though, are almost impossible to regulate under the law. This hasn't stopped some people from trying, so today, especially on some college campuses, we have an enforcement or attempted enforcement of language norms that rightly concerns free speech advocates. But I want to suggest that an aversion to coerced language norms should not distract us from recognizing the power and the harm of the hurtful insults. Seeing this power and harm can inform our choice of language for the sake of those around us, whether we have the right to say it or not. And we can make similar choices about the conversation stopper. Think of words like close-minded or ignorant or extremist. These labels are often descriptive and sometimes they can wound, but most often they're deployed to end a conversation. One of the most common examples today of the conversation stopper is labeling someone else a bigot. And this version frequently appears against religious believers and groups with traditional beliefs in sexuality. We can find it on Facebook pages and Twitter feeds and online comments. Now, certainly some religious believers are bigots. They are, as the dictionary would tell us, filled with hatred and intolerance and strongly disliking of others. But this bigotry label is not generalizable to all religious believers, and it's usually deployed to end a conversation. The hurtful insult and the conversation stopper stigmatize people instead of critiquing ideas. They are often efforts to cast people as unacceptable or beyond the pale, either for who they are or for what they believe. The hurtful insult says, "I don't have to respect you as a human being." And the conversation stopper says, "I don't have to listen to you." How do we work to avoid these forms of speech? I want to suggest that when we have confidence in our own views and beliefs, in the midst of deep differences around us, we can engage more charitably with others in our speech and our actions and avoid particularly these forms of speech. Instead of lashing out at others or retreating to our own echo chambers, we can engage in dialogue and common existence, even when and especially when we believe that our views are in fact the better ones. And I want to suggest to you 3 aspirations that can help get us there: tolerance, humility, and patience. And I'm going to define each of these with some particularity, especially the first one, which is today often misinterpreted. Tolerance is the recognition that people, for the most part, are free to pursue their own beliefs and practices, even when we strongly object to them. It is not full acceptance. And so today you'll often hear people say, true tolerance is fully accepting me for who I am. Let you be you and me be me. And that's not actually tolerance. In fact, I think that's ultimately a philosophical impossibility. We tolerate people when we endure other people for the sake of our shared existence across disagreements. And tolerance then requires the hard work of distinguishing people from their ideas. It doesn't preclude us from critiquing or disagreeing with ideas, but it does ask that we aim for fair discussion with other people. We know this to be the case. We know that all ideas aren't actually good and right, because we all know people who think that some of our ideas are crazy or illogical or even immoral, and we think that the same of others. And so tolerance is not a full acceptance or embrace, but it's a willingness to pursue shared discussion across difference. It won't be easy, as one philosopher has said. The basic difficulty of tolerance is that we need it only for the intolerable. Humility goes a step further. Humility asks us to recognize that some of our most deeply held beliefs and practices will be found morally problematic by others, and we won't always be able to prove why we're right and they're wrong. Humility is a recognition of the limitations of how we can make arguments and of logical argument. It doesn't surrender claims to truth, and it's not the same as relativism. But it does ask us to recognize that people's starting points, especially about some of the most contested issues, are far different than ours and may not always be proven in the conversation. Sometimes we will have to show over the course of a lifetime our differences rather than try to state them. And finally, patience. Patience points toward restraint, persistence, and endurance. It encourages efforts to listen, understand, and perhaps even to empathize. We don't have to accept or affirm as we do so. And in fact, it might be that patient listening eventually leads me to conclude that you were just as crazy as I thought you were. But we can at least assume a posture that assumes a different possibility, that moves beyond caricatured dismissals of others before we even hear what they have to say. These three aspirations of tolerance, patience, and humility can facilitate creative partnerships across difference. This bridge building might not overcome our ideological differences. We will not find agreement on all of the difficult issues that divide us. But we can begin to build we can begin to bridge relational distance with ordinary acts like sharing a meal or just having a conversation. We can find common ground even when we don't agree on a common good. But finding common ground begins with acknowledging the reality of our differences. Without the ability to air real disagreement, real dialogue will occur less frequently, and our assumptions will go unchallenged. Tolerance will become that demand for acceptance. Humility will be overcome by moral certainty, and patience will lose to outrage. I worry that our failure to practice real dialogue across real difference will ultimately deprive us of the ability to have such dialogue. And in the midst of these challenges, we are also confronting a crisis of authority that feels relatively new, that further hinders our ability to find common ground. The weakening of major institutions across politics, education, the media, and religion, the demise of truly national leaders in these sectors, and the rise of social media have all contributed to this crisis of authority. In late 2016, I was on a panel in New York City with the pastor Tim Keller and the journalist Nick Kristof. And toward the end of this panel, we were asked a question: what for each of you in your spheres of influence or your institutions do you see as the greatest challenges and opportunities? And so I went first, and I talked about the law. I talked about some challenges in the law and some real opportunities. And then Keller went and focused mostly on some real challenges that the church was confronting today. And Kristof then turned to the media rather bleakly. And at the end of those guys talking, I said, well, the law is starting to look pretty good here. I thought it was a mixed bag, but after hearing you two, I think the law might be where our hope should be. Not really. Don't hope in the law. But Christoph closed with this comment that is worth quoting to you, talking about the media. If you think we did a bad job in the last 20 years as the media collectively, then I'm afraid that we're going to do an even worse job in the next 10 to 20. And the reason, essentially, is that the business model of traditional journalism has largely collapsed. Christoph noted that media outlets are desperate for audiences, and the best way to build an audience is by highlighting animosity and minimizing nuance. This does not bode well for the future of the media, and it does not bode well for the future of our collective self-understanding. The more intense and frequent our echo chambers sound, the less we will have a shared understanding of reality. This fracturing of authority and pressure on our institutions and the retreat into our echo chambers poses significant obstacles to what I've called a modest unity, the minimal amount of consensus and sense of belonging that we, the people of this country, need in order to make confident pluralism possible. So is there place for optimism here? Some people have actually accused me of a naive form of optimism, and one reviewer of my book, who was otherwise fairly positive to me, wrote that it was doomed to immediate irrelevance. And in his view, this was because it would lack an audience that could understand it or care about it. I don't think that's right. Despite the many challenges that I've just named, I do remain cautiously optimistic. One reason is that the American experiment in pluralism, for all of its failures and shortcomings, has actually worked out for much of our country's history. This is not the first time that we've confronted deep racial tensions, divergent views of morality, or religious differences. And in many ways, the success of the American political experiment has always required finding and maintaining a modest unity against great odds. This is not the first time we have encountered profound and unsettling disagreements. America's founders did not actually agree that all men, to say nothing of women, were created equal. In the Declaration of Independence, the boundaries of liberty were contested, and the word happiness evoked a civic-mindedness that not everybody shared. Nor did our differences stop there. If we think that only words divided us in the past, we might remember the significant obstacles that we have overcome. It's true that at the founding of our country, those with political power were largely white Protestant men, and some people might say, well, how hard was it for them to get along? But in fact, at that very time elsewhere in the world, people were killing each other over those religious differences, and so it's no small thing that we found some modest unity even back then. The Declaration of Independence closes with words that are less known to most people than those at the beginning. It reads, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Today, an increasing number of Americans reject the premise of divine providence, and we may also argue about the meaning and relevance of some of those other words. So did the founders. But perhaps some of my optimism comes from believing in the notion of mutually pledging to each other our lives. I'm also cautiously optimistic because of a lot of smart and caring people I've met around this country. These are not people who usually make the headlines, but their good and sometimes ordinary work performs the extraordinary task of keeping us together on a very practical level. We need to be telling each other more stories of highlighting this good work. Stories about surprising friendships between people who disagree about really important matters, but who come together through important partnerships to better our cities in places like Portland and St. Louis and Memphis, and about ordinary neighbors and strangers coming together to help victims of natural disasters in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico. In these instances and others, people can work across differences and the challenges of pluralism toward very practical ends. For Christians, of course, there's an even greater basis for confidence, rooted in the theological virtue of hope. We can engage in this messy and uncertain world because we know the end of the story. Christians of all people should see not only the challenges of pluralism, but also the opportunities, precisely because our confidence is in the gospel. And so let me offer 3 practical examples for Christians to live into confident pluralism. The first is in the realm of politics. It doesn't take a stable genius to recognize how broken our politics are today. But we can't give up on political engagements, especially at the local level. Politics, of course, is messy, and Christians who enter politics are going to find themselves working in coalitions with people who disagree with them and who are sometimes antithetical to gospel purposes. That means it's going to take both wisdom and humility to navigate, but we can be doing this, and we can be doing this either directly or by supporting others, civic leaders who work to improve neighborhoods and school districts, lawyers, judges, and police officers who work not only for peace and stability, but also for the trust and respect of their local communities. For many people in this country, politics is not just a topic for debate around the dinner table, but it's a vehicle through which urgent needs are addressed. That's particularly true where the social fabric is especially torn. In these settings, politics and institutions and law and government can often be a matter of life and death. Christians have a role to play in these settings, not as self-interested rulers, but as active participants seeking the good of our neighbors. The second area where Christians can engage more confidently and more boldly in our society is by leading the charge for renewed attention to issues of racial justice and structural racism. Despite the many failures of the white church to show love in this area, the gospel has tremendous resources for seeking justice and peace across racial divisions. The death and resurrection of Jesus has broken down cultural barriers throughout history more than any other major religion. Part of our engagement in these issues means learning about the enormous consequences, especially to communities of color, of mass incarceration, of continued neighborhood and school segregation, of education inequity and healthcare disparities. We can learn about long-standing policies and practices and how they disproportionately harm some of our neighbors, and we can take the time to listen, perhaps first learning how to listen. We might also pay greater attention here to the power of protest and dissent. We've seen this recently with symbolic pressures and responses to the national anthem that began with Colin Kaepernick's refusal to stand. How might Christians think about this kind of protest through the lens of confident pluralism? Well, I don't have a complete answer here, but let me offer 3 tentative thoughts. First, I think we have to honor and protect the right to dissent, even when we disagree. Second, we ought to strive for empathy and understanding of those who do protest and not leave it to what we read about what's going on. And finally, Christians especially ought to remember that our ultimate allegiance is to God and not to any country or nation. And sometimes protests like this can serve as an important reminder of the limits of our allegiance to government. Don't mishear me here. There's much that I like about this country. I've served as an active duty military officer and a government lawyer. I've experienced powerful forms of patriotism, including with my colleagues at the Pentagon in the hours after terrorists crashed a plane into our building on 9/11. I still stand reverently for the national anthem, but I understand why some people choose not to stand. And even though I do stand, I don't place my hand over my heart. A final example of confident pluralism for those of us in this room is our engagement with other faiths, particularly in the cause of religious freedom. Many Christians today feel increasing pressures to their institutions and their ways of life, and some of these challenges are significant. Campus ministries now experience hurdles to access to campus. Social service agencies confront regulations in tension with their missional convictions, and educational institutions face threats to their accreditation. These are serious challenges, and we ought not be naive to them. We should work diligently for appropriate legal and policy responses. But we must also make our case in publicly accessible terms that appeal to people of goodwill from a variety of religious traditions and those of no religious tradition. In doing so, we cannot ignore the importance of religious liberty for everyone. There is no principled legal or theological argument that only looks to the good of Christians. Today's political climate makes it especially essential for Christians to pursue meaningful public partnerships with American Muslims. We would benefit ourselves from such partnerships in charitable work, in advocating for the value of pluralism in this country, and in defending the importance of religious liberty. And we can pursue these efforts again at the local level as well, finding and engaging Muslim neighbors, loving them well, and taking the lead in defending their religious freedom. In each of these areas I've described, in politics, race, and interfaith partnerships, the posture of confident pluralism allows us to seek common ground with others, even when we don't agree on a common good. Finding common ground does not mean endorsing every goal or every value of the people to whom we draw near, but it does mean drawing near. You and I can do this with or without the constitutional protections I discussed earlier. There is a great deal of work to be done in the legal and the policy spaces, work to rehabilitate the right of association and to strengthen the public forum. But win or lose those efforts, we can still model confident pluralism in our engagement with others. And many of us in this room can embrace this idea precisely because our confidence lies elsewhere. We can pursue tolerance, humility, and patience because we ground our lives in faith and hope and love. Thank you.
Thank you. There are lots of good questions coming in here.
Skip all the hard ones.
Okay. Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska was on campus in April and talked about the Millennial Generation being adverse to conflict and not wanting to offend anyone. He brought up concerns about that generation potentially not protecting free speech. Do you share any of those concerns?
So a preliminary response, and we mentioned this earlier to the call group, I'm reticent to adopt generalizations about generations, right? And so I think that we don't want to talk about the millennials or the boomers. Having said that, there is polling data that suggests that polling of that age group suggests, among other things, a decreased willingness or readiness to defend speech we don't like, right? Including a desire to outlaw hate speech and that sort of thing. And this is a concern, and I think part of the burden is on the rest of us to recognize that we can't just take for granted how we got to where we are. The First Amendment is a balance of costs and benefits, and at great cost, we allow for harmful and destructive speech to be legal. But we have to know and we have to tell others why we've settled on those costs and why we've struck that balance. And not everybody's going to know about McCarthyism or the challenges we've faced in the past unless we tell those stories.
Right. So there are a few questions here along the lines of, are some viewpoints so extreme that they should not be tolerated? And you're already pointing in that direction.
And I'll also say there that the basic idea of pluralism or allowing for maximal difference is always going to be limited in any society. So there's no such thing as pure pluralism. Here in the United States, as I said earlier to our class, you can't create the cult of child sacrifice. And you can't start the Grand Rapids chapter of Al-Qaeda, right? So there are going to be things that are just out of bounds. And the really hard political questions are, what more do we place in those categories? I think we need to be very cautious about sending our fellow citizens and their groups into those spaces that are out of bounds, but some groups are always going to be there.
There's a question from an audience member wondering if you could comment on hate crime legislation. I suppose the value or the particulars of such.
Right, so I think this is a variant of what we were just talking about in the challenge of hate speech, and some criminal legislation adds enhanced penalties when crimes are done out of particular bias or hate. And I think these are really complicated questions, but I think to the extent that we punish certain forms of criminal behavior more for what perceived motives can be, we create some perhaps unintended inequities. And so I think when we're trying to formalize in the criminal law these restrictions against hate, we often tie ourselves up in knots, and I want us to work very diligently to minimize hate speech and hateful people, but I'm not always sure the criminal law is the way to do that.
A student asked, how do we begin to have conversations with others who are irrational and stubborn about their political beliefs? Which I think points to the thread of, it seems to me you can only, well, maybe I'm wrong, that it's harder to engage in the three practices you advise if the other person isn't also playing by those rules. In
some ways, right? That was a great question. I think, so there are always going to be people at the extremes, and this is both left and right, who are so, we might say irrational, or so not interested in playing by the rules of the game that they are practically unreachable. And I don't actually want to spend a lot of time trying to convince those people. The gamble here is that there are enough of us who aren't like that, who are willing to try and work across these differences. But the challenge is our initial differences will often translate into thinking that somebody is just irrational, right? I mean, if you don't think what I think, you must be bonkers. And in fact, maybe the starting point is to say, with a degree of humility, I want to hear what you think and why you think something. And I'm also willing to say that I don't have all of the answers. And this doesn't mean that we give up everything, right? So there are certain convictions that I have and that you have and that we live our entire lives around. And so I'm not willing to put everything up for grabs, but I am willing to say that because of my convictions and because of the hope that I have, bring your hardest questions and let's have a conversation.
Along those lines, and I should say, I'm Karen Soppy from the English department. I have the privilege of teaching a class called Inside the January series, and our students met with John this morning. And after you left, one of the conversations, one of the threads that continued was the question of how tolerant we ought to be when we're talking with someone we know well and care deeply about who doesn't share our faith beliefs. In other words, are there different rules to play by when the stakes of salvation seem high? One of the students asked, if I believe that my friend's eternal salvation depends on believing what I believe, how tolerant can I or should I be of that person's other beliefs or lack of belief? You're nodding, right? This is a hard question. Is that a different arena of conversation from most of our political conversations?
Well, the particular question is especially important for Christians, and there's a risk here that this push for a kind of the kind of tolerance that doesn't want to offend can sometimes push us in the directions of never saying anything that risks offense. And I don't think, there's plenty in Scripture that suggests the message of the cross will be offensive. And so there are important costs that we count as Christians in our engagement with others. And I do think, though, we could stand to be better at contextualizing evangelism and apologetics. It used to be, when I was in high school or in college, there were people, and maybe they still do this, right, walking on the beach with the 4 spiritual laws. And I think we're just for many people, in a different cultural space that is going to require more context, more relationship first, and starting with a lack of cultural literacy about what the Bible even says. And so we can't assume, those of you who are pastors, right, can no longer assume that people sitting in front of you on Sunday mornings understand Scripture. And so you've got to start at an earlier point. And I think that's just prudence and wisdom, but not to the sacrifice of truth, and truth is sometimes going to offend.
One of our administrators asks, can you speak to the issue of anonymous speech as it pertains to freedom of speech issues? Should anonymous speech on websites, chat rooms, comment boards, etc. deserve the same freedoms or protections? How has the rise of anonymous speech affected our dialogue as a nation?
Yeah, so legally, I think it's very hard to protect or to regulate anonymous speech. I think there should be protections for anonymity in some political actions, right? If you don't want to disclose a particular party identification or something like that, we need protections for that. But it's going to be hard to regulate anonymous speech, but do it when you can. So I think it's utterly or often destructive, especially in these comments threads on websites, and there are ways to, I've known a number of news sites that have just shut them down completely because they're not helpful at all. On the other hand, some forms of anonymous speech can be really important to voicing something that somebody is not going to be able to say because of cultural or political reasons. And so we have to have, I think, avenues for responsible anonymous speech, but not taking it too far.
Should we ask LGBT individuals to be tolerant toward individuals who refuse them a service otherwise offered to heterosexual people?
Well, there's a big question. I think, the tolerance as a posture is maybe different when we're talking about listening to a certain perspective and experiencing some forms of exclusion or discrimination. And I think these are a really hard set of questions to which there is no uniform answer. So should a private Christian student group be able to say, you can only be part of our group if you adhere to certain standards? I think yes, and that cuts in the face of some progressive arguments to the contrary. Should the Marriott, owned by a Christian businessman, be able to say, you can't rent a room here if you're in a same-sex relationship? I think no, right? And then there are going to be a lot of hard cases in the middle. And right now, culturally and legally, we're sorting through those cases. But maybe as the practical individual thought experiment might be, can you and I, as much as possible, try to put ourselves in the shoes of the other person? And how would it feel to be told no or to be excluded? And even if you end up on the line, as I do with, say, a private student group of saying, yes, there should be the ability to exclude, can we at least count and articulate the costs and the harms? And I think we often don't do a very good job of that because we're so entrenched in articulating our rights or our preferences.
I'm hearing echoes. Shane Claiborne was here the other day and kept calling on Christians to do better, that there are laws and there are possibilities, but we need to do better. And I think I hear you saying the same thing, is apart from legislation, how do we as individuals take the high road?
And also take more risks, right? I think
Sure.
we're very risk averse right now, and I'm not sure why. We of all people should have the confidence to take risks and to go into messy partnerships in unknown spaces.
Does confident pluralism have its limits? For instance, are there issues like climate change, which has direct, widespread consequences that confident pluralism can't adequately address?
Oh, I'm sure it has all kinds of limits. I think that there are, at a very theoretical and high level, there are going to be issues in discourse that will have more or less salience over time, and to which there will be more or less agreement. And then the hard challenge is, where do those issues fall? I think, in often more progressive circles, climate change is one of those issues, and often more conservative circles, abortion is one of those issues. And there are some really hard issues where people think the stakes are so enormous that we can't just work through this agree to disagree posture. I also think that there are far fewer of those issues than we tend to think, right? And so it might be a nice place to start by saying, how big is that bucket of issues? And are there matters of severe and significant disagreement with consequences, but that we can actually live to tolerate for a while?
Does it make sense to start with some that don't feel quite as extreme? I mean, to build relationships and practices of conversation that can eventually let us talk about the really big, hard ones?
Yeah, I totally agree. This is kind of basic social skills, right? So I sometimes hear people who want to talk about, find another person of another race and let's talk about race.
Yeah.
Maybe we should start with, what's your name? And where are you?
Yeah.
We can build up to the hard questions. And then the other one, and this is a freebie, but don't try this first with your families, okay? Families are, for whatever reason, families are the hardest, so practice a little bit on your friends and acquaintances first and then move into the family space.
Yes. What practical ways can reasonable Christians hold the media accountable for reckless, divisive, and degenerative 24-hour conversation? I'm trying to give you the easy ones, John.
Right, wow. So how do you, well, I think for partly the reasons that Nick Kristof identified, I'm not sure there is going to be a holding accountable I think we're going to see an increasing fracture and dispersion of authority, and I actually think this is really important for people of all ages to recognize the extent to which authority and news has been already fractured to a point that is quite different than where it used to be. So I was giving a talk in Nashville maybe last year, and a very good question, but I thought a bit out of place question was from someone in the audience who was, we'll say older than not, who said, the media is a huge problem. Why don't we get the heads of CBS and ABC and CNN together in a room and do something about this? And so I said, quick poll of the room, how many of you here are older than 60 and then younger than 40? And the number of people in the room under 40 who get their news from one of those big sources is minuscule, right? Almost everybody is getting news these days, especially younger folks, from different Facebook feeds and others. And so there is no possibility of focusing on a few key media players to bring change. So what do Christians do in the absence of that? Well, I think we work hard to, as much as we can, to platform the sane people and to work hard to share with others around us in our spheres of influence who those people are. But I don't think we're going to get rid of the bomb throwers.
Question from an alum. In an age where even concrete facts are seemingly up for debate, is there any room for actual factual correction, especially when others believe fact is a matter of opinion? How can we approach that kind of correction well?
Yeah, well, these are hard, aren't they? I think that the challenges we're facing are in some ways an outgrowth of the last 30 or 40 years in the university and the kinds of philosophical changes we've seen that have pressed on these questions. But having said that, I do think we can still make a distinction between basic denials of reality and contested factual interpretations. So one of the courses I teach is criminal law. And in criminal law, think of any hard case, there are going to be contested interpretations of what happened. Was this a justified killing or was it self-defense? Was this a rape or was this consensual? And those can get very complicated depending on perspective and context and interpretation. But there are other questions factually that are just answerable still. And to give up on facts, as some people seem to be doing, is extremely destructive. If we can't agree on a basic sense of the shared space of reality, we're not going to be able to discourse. And we can tolerate at the extreme fringes denial of reality, but the rest of us have to be working to recognize charitable differences in interpretation, but also insisting that we're talking about the same facts.
Are there theologians who've influenced you in the area of common ground and common good?
Yeah, I think the most important theologian in my own thinking is Leslie Newbigin in his book, his short book called Proper Confidence, and the subtitle there is Faith, Doubt, and Certainty in Christian Discipleship, and it's a wonderful book. And I've also been influenced, actually by a number of folks, but Stanley Hauerwas also comes to mind, a mentor of mine in graduate school. And what I really appreciated about Hauerwas is not always what he wrote, and some of what he wrote I don't agree with, and some of it I do, but he really modeled this in his career and in his life. And so he was the one at Duke who would go across and say to the atheist philosopher, let's teach a class together, right? Or he would go take time out of his own interests to go be in other places. And I think as faculty and as citizens, we can model more of that too to others.
There's a question. You mentioned that you stand for the national anthem, but don't put your hand over your heart. Can you explain that briefly?
So I think, to me, this is a reminder to me in the midst of the national anthem that I am in a qualified way proud of this country, and I am proud to have served it in the military, but I don't pledge my allegiance to this country, and I don't, this country is not the hard issue for me. The hard issue is my allegiance to God and my identity as a Christian, and maybe in a slightly more abstract but really important way, my allegiance to the worldwide church and its witness on this earth. And so I really like living here, but I don't want to pledge my allegiance here.
Mm-hmm. On that note, Mr. Inazu will be out front to sign books and talk with you. I thank you all for coming. Hope you have a great day. Thank you, John, so much. Thanks for being here.